Good evening, Rowan. It's the 5th of August 2016 and it's about 10:30, and obviously I'm making you my usual Friday evening video to reassure you I won't be seducing any priests over the weekend because I'm saving myself for my beloved who I'm going to be with the moment you're in jail. I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to it. He's so gorgeous. Anyway, I thought we could continue this evening our little chat about the bizarre lecture that you gave in Sheffield the day after I confronted you at the Churches Together in South Yorkshire Autumn Forum in 2014. And I'll mention a bit more about that in a minute. But in the last video, I was talking about what you said about God, the Holy Trinity, and one particular aspect of that that I mentioned that you said was that you said that God kind of stretched out, that's not the word you used, expanded out somehow and caught up creation within himself. And I said that you always promote this idea of deifying material things, created things, and this is in keeping with the globalist agenda of environmentalism and earth worship as the unifying one world religion. So you deified creation, created things when you were talking about the Holy Trinity kind of acting in an expansive way and catching up creation into itself. That's more or less what you said. So there's actually two aspects to the predominant ideology which will be imposed on everybody in the New World Order by the globalists. And one is this idea of the deification of the earth and human beings being subjugated to the earth. That's why they can depopulate and tell people where they can live and what resources they can use and that kind of thing, and just get rid of people if they say that they're damaging the environment. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is the dominant ideology of collectivism, which I've mentioned before, and you do always promote collectivism. And this is obviously just a complete coincidence that this is the globalist agenda, earth worship and collectivism, in which individual rights are subjugated to the collective. Therefore, powerful people can simply say, oh, you're acting in a way that's harming other people, you're not allowed to say this, you're not allowed to do that. It gives them the excuse to control people, to control their freedom of speech and movement and so on. It's a tool by which the powerful can control the masses, collectivism, and the erosion of the understanding of human beings as individual entities with inherent rights granted by the Creator, which has kind of been the founding ideology, for want of a better word, of Western civilization, that human beings have inherent rights granted to them by the Creator, and this is why murder is wrong, for example, and stealing other people's goods, because people have individual inherent rights. So collectivism um, does away with the idea that individuals have inherent rights and can't be subjugated to the will of the collective. So, in a collectivist society, it's a very bad thing to be in a minority. And I don't mean a racial minority so much, because these people talk about diversity and they're not that bothered about people having different skin colours or wearing different kinds of clothing and that kind of thing. But they don't really like people having different ideas. There's this idea that everyone can look different, but all everybody has to think in the same way and to subjugate what might be their dearly held beliefs to the collective understanding, and this is really the drive of cultural Marxism, that everybody has to think in the same way and hold the same values and so on. And you do actually mention some of the cultural Marxist narrative a bit later in this lecture, but I'll come on to that. So I'm going to come on to what you say now. So you've just talked about the Holy Trinity, and you said there's two aspects of it. There's what the Holy Trinity says about God, even though you defined God purely in human terms, which I talked about in the last video. The doctrine of the Trinity you defined purely in human terms when it's a doctrine explaining the nature of God, primarily and totally, in fact. But then you say that human beings are created in the image of God. So if God's a Trinity, this kind of has an implication for human beings who are created in the image of God. So this is what you go on to say. You're talking about the other side now. So you've talked about God, and now you're talking about what the doctrine of the Trinity means for human beings, even though that's what you talked about in the first part when you said you were talking about God. So you say, but then to the other side of the story, which is talking about us, talking about humanity, the Bible tells us that we're made in God's image. You're not usually too bothered what the Bible says, are you? Only when it says what you want it to say. So you're using this in the context of God being a Trinity, the Holy Trinity. This isn't usually how human beings being created in the image of God is understood. Nobody usually talks about the Holy Trinity in this respect. It's more like human beings are able to employ reason and share certain attributes of God, I suppose you could say, like being able to overcome natural instincts and uh, being able to act in an altruistic way and being able to share some of the attributes of God, like being loving and that kind of thing. So that's normally what human beings being created in the image of God tends to it tends to be talked about in those terms, really. And the Trinitarian nature of God isn't usually related to this Christian teaching and Jewish teaching that human beings are created in the image of God. This isn't usually related to the Holy Trinity. So you say the Bible tells us that we're made in God's image, and so if God is the kind of God we've been thinking about just now, the God who is this extraordinary interweaving of independent agency in love and response and generosity, then our own lives as God's image become, of course, much more involved in that sort of reality. And the way you say this word reality is quite unusual, really. It's in a kind of ironic way you say it, as if you're trying to imprint the idea in people's minds that it isn't a reality. You're actually undermining the belief in God and in the Holy Trinity by using the word reality in the way that you say it. It's like you're questioning it or saying it's not really true, like it's reality in inverted commas. But I'm going to play the clip anyway so people can see for themselves. So you say, we need to think of ourselves not so much as little billiard ball individuals, but as beings who are, from the very start, summoned into and created in and constituted in relation with one another. And that's why thinking through what prayer means, what we have to say about God in the light of our prayer, brings us back to some very immediate and practical questions about what we think we are. In other words, we can't pray in this sort of way and hang on to an unchanged, unchallenged picture of our humanity. We can't pray like this to a God like this And just imagine that we are independent little billiard balls, each one of us with our own will and our own needs and our own rights and everything else. And you know that's the first thing and the only thing. And you make a funny gesture. So what you're saying is that if people are praying, the implication being that they're praying properly, I suppose. So what you're saying is, if Christians are praying, they're going to change their idea about the nature of human beings. Well, let's just imagine that these people who are Christians, who you're talking to, have been Christians all their life, and they've been taught Christian doctrine all their life. Well, then you should really assume from a Christian perspective that they already have the right idea about human nature and identity and so on. So why would praying mean that they would change their mind about anything anyway, if they've been taught Christian doctrine correctly from the start and they didn't have um, a different idea about human nature, shall we say. So you're giving these people the idea that if they start praying, they're going to change their minds about what constitutes human nature and identity. And what you're saying is that they need to get away from this idea that human beings are independent little billiard balls, each one of us with our own will and our own needs and our own rights and everything else. You know, that's the first thing and the only thing. Well, the thing is, Rowan, we are all independent. We all have our own will. Each individual has his or her own will, own needs, own rights, and everything else in relation to that. So you really are promoting collectivism here, and the idea that somehow becoming closer to God and praying more changes your idea about your individual rights and will, and needs. Who can say that individuals don't have needs and don't have wishes and don't have rights? Only a collectivist, really. Or a slave owner would say that individuals don't have rights and their own will and so on. So you're promoting collectivism and the idea that praying and coming closer to God makes a person less individual and more involved with the collective. And you say that this is the first thing and the only thing. This is believing you have your own rights and individuality and so on. So I don't really know many people who think that their own will and needs and rights are the only thing, because most people do have relationships with other people to some degree. Most people have children who they would be looking after, and they would subjugate their own needs to their children and so on. And there's lots of other relationships like that where you can't just go along. I mean, if you're working for an employer, you can't just do whatever you want. You've got a contract to perform a certain job, and that's what you have to do regardless of what you feel like at that point in time. So I don't really know who these individuals are who think that this is the only thing, as if it's possible to be such an individualist anyway. You're creating a false dichotomy, that there's only these two extremes. Either you think you're completely on your own and need nothing to do with anyone else, and to hell with everyone else, basically, or you're subsumed into the collective and there isn't anything in between. So you've created a false dichotomy, really. So you go on to say, we're going to be discovering our own humanity. This is when we're praying, I suppose. We're going to be discovering our own humanity, like God's divinity exists in relationship, exists in patterns of giving and responding. I'm not sure it's necessary to pray to discover that, to be honest. I mean, I think just about everybody knows that. So you go on to say, more particularly, of course, there's something that's really brought home to us by this idea of talking to God as if we were Jesus. Because in this we learn that eventually, as we grow up in our belief, what's going on is that the relationship that Jesus has with God is the relationship for which we're made. And that, as St. Paul says, is the relationship of a son or daughter. We're made to have a relationship with God for which some kinds of family relationship are the best analogy we can find. And that has to do with intimacy, with the right and the privilege of access. There is your home. That's where you can always go. So I suppose you're saying that you've kind of, you become a child of God, and that gives you certain rights. It doesn't really. You don't have the right of access. You're invited into relationship with God, and as a Christian to accept Christ, to turn to Christ, and then you're welcomed into the heavenly kingdom, I suppose, and into the church, into the family of believers. But you can cut yourself off from that. For example, by selling your soul to Satan. So you've mentioned the parable of the prodigal son before, where one of the sons takes his inheritance and he goes off and spends it all on loose living, and then he ends up starving in a foreign country, and he decides to go back home and ask his father if he will take him into his house as a hired servant, because he says he's not worthy to be called his son anymore because he's squandered all his inheritance, basically. So he goes back and says to his father that he's not worthy to be called his son, and would he take him in as a hired servant. And his father flings his arms around him and puts all the best clothes on him and throws a party to celebrate him coming home. And you do have this image in your mind that you have the right to do this, because you have spoken about it and I've commented on this before. But the point is, you don't seem to want to take the first step, do you, and say, I've sinned against heaven and I'm not worthy to be called your son. You want to be demanding reconciliation, as you call it, with your victims, which what you really mean is capitulation and giving you what you want and indulging you. You don't even mean reconciliation. You don't want to be forgiven. So you don't seem to want to take this first step, which would enable you to re-enter in the heavenly household, I suppose you could say, which is kind of what you're talking about here. So you haven't got a right, really. You haven't got the right to demand that God let you in. You've misquoted or quoted out of context Teresa of Avila in her Way of Perfection, saying more or less the same thing, and I have already made a video about that, saying that if you return to God like the prodigal, then God has to let you in, because this is what he's promised, really, which is true. God wouldn't go against his nature, but the problem is you're not returning like the prodigal, are you? You're telling everyone you're wonderful already, you've never done anything wrong, it's your victim's fault. That they don't want anything to do with you, and they're bad and sinful and judgmental, particularly me, and all this kind of thing. So you're only telling half the story when you say you've got the right to return and you've got the right to access of God's household. You haven't got the right in any circumstances. God's made a covenant, and you need to play your part in that by repenting of your sins and turning to Christ, to re-enter God's household, so to speak. And you don't seem to want to do that. You just want to save your own skin, it seems, by looking at the things you say and your behaviour. So you go on to say, and connected with that is something I find quite difficult to spell out, which I think is quite important in this context. And that is what I've sometimes called a balancing between freedom and dependence. And you go on to say, we can make two lethal and disastrous mistakes. You do use words like lethal and toxic and poisonous quite often. It's quite melodramatic, really, because you make it sound like something terrible's going to happen if you think in a certain way or act in a certain way. And usually the things that you're talking about are not really that significant. So it's just real melodrama, trying to, I think, manipulate people to accept what you say and go along with the things that you're teaching them, which usually don't bear very much resemblance to Christian doctrine. So you go on to say, we can think that the most important thing of all is being free, and being free means having nothing to do with anybody else, owing no one anything, and being able to decide exactly what we want for ourselves without reference to anything else at all. And you raise your voice an octave there to try and sound authoritative. And you say, and to have the glorious privilege of being able to choose this particular brand of cornflakes from the supermarket shelf. That's freedom, consumer freedom, individualist freedom, the freedom that's about my will, my preference. That's one lethal error. So that's the use of the word lethal again. And you raise your voice an octave to sound authoritative once again. And you say, and you may have noticed there's quite a lot of it around in all of us, and not just in the world. I think that's what you say after that, leaving a pause. So this is quite a misrepresentation of individualism, really, that it's all about having the being able to choose this particular brand of cornflakes from the supermarket, when really it's about the individual having rights and other individuals not having the right to enslave the person or force the person to do things against his or her will, which is what you've done to me. You think I should subjugate my individual rights and dignity and identity to go along with your perverted and satanic agenda. So you've kind of belittled what individualism actually means. The belief that individuals are distinct entities and that they have inherent rights, to make it all about choosing a particular brand of cornflakes from the supermarket, which is quite irrelevant. But I would say, on the subject of collectivism, in relation to choosing a particular brand of cornflakes, well, in the Soviet Union, which was a collectivist society, people were having to spend half their life in long queues simply to get the basic necessities of life. So it's a product of a more individualist society that people are able to go and choose food to eat and not have to spend half their lives just trying to get their basic necessities. And also the central planning that goes along in collectivist states or societies. The planning's done by idiots like you who don't know about the basic necessities of life, like farming and baking, for example. So in the Soviet Union, they murdered quite a lot of peasants and threw them off the land, and then no one knew how to farm the land, and millions of people starved to death. So that's the result of collectivism, really. There isn't a lot of benefit to collectivism for the people that collectivists claim to be helping, particularly, who are the ones who suffer most as a result of collectivist societies because they've got less power and resources to be bribing all the corrupt officials, like you, for example. So this is why it's very important that individuals have rights and that they can't be subjugated to the collective, to the state, or to any other dictatorial individual or body.
But then to the other side of the story, which is talking about us, talking about humanity. The Bible tells us that we're made in God's image. And so if God is the kind of God we've been thinking about just now, the God who is this extraordinary interweaving of independent agency in love and response and generosity, then our own lives as God's image become, of course, much more involved in that sort of reality. We need to think of ourselves not so much as little billiard ball individuals, but as beings who are from the very start summoned into and created in, constituted in relation with one another. And that's why thinking through what prayer means, what we have to say about God in the light of our prayer, brings us back to some very immediate and practical questions about what we think we are. In other words, we can't pray in this sort of way and hang on to an unchanged, unchallenged picture of our humanity. We can't pray like this to a God like this and just imagine that we are independent little billiard balls, each one of us with our own will and our own needs and our own rights and everything else, and that's the first thing and the only thing. We're going to be discovering that our very humanity, like God's divinity, exists in relationship, exists in patterns of giving and responding. More particularly, of course, there's something that's really brought home to us by this idea of talking to God as if we were Jesus. Because in this we learn that eventually, as we grow up in our belief, what's going on is that the relationship Jesus has with God is the relationship for which we're made. And that, as St. Paul says, is the relationship of a son or a daughter. We are made to have a relationship with God for which some kinds of family relationship are the best analogy we can find. And that has to do with intimacy, with the right and the privilege of access. There is your home, that's where you can always go. And connected with that, something which I find quite difficult to spell out, but which I think is quite important in this context. And that's what I've sometimes called a balancing between freedom and dependence. We can make two lethal and disastrous mistakes about being human. We can think that the most important thing of all is being free, and being free means having nothing to do with anybody else, owing no one anything, and being able to decide exactly what we want for ourselves without reference to anything else at all, and to have the glorious privilege of being able to choose this particular brand of cornflakes from the supermarket shelf. That's freedom. Consumer freedom. Individualist freedom. The freedom that's about my will, my preference. That's one lethal error, and you may have noticed there's quite a lot of it around in all of us, not just out there.
So you go on to say, and then there's dependence. This is your two toxic mistakes that you're talking about, or lethal errors. So the one is individualism, and this one is dependence. So you go on to say, and then there's dependence on its own. The willingness to let other people tell us what to do, accepting being slaves, accepting being at the mercy of other people, accepting that someone else is always going to have the right to tell us what to do, and we just have to shrug our shoulders and get on with it. That the world is forever divided into the powerful and the powerless, and that we're on the wrong side of that. well, you're not really on the wrong side of it, are you? Because you're the one who's going around dictating to people and wrecking their lives, and you're colluding with these extremely wealthy, powerful globalists who control everything, which I'm going to say some more about in a minute. But I just want to point out that in the previous part of this lecture, where you were talking about individualism that I've just talked about, that you're using oratory techniques to make yourself sound more authoritative and as if you're condemning certain attitudes that you define as individualistic, like having rights and that's all there is to it and so on, which I've commented on. You don't use these oratory techniques in this part of the lecture where you're talking about dependence, where you haven't described it as lethal, I don't think, either. This idea that you should be dependent and have people pushing you around and accepting, you should accept being a slave and accept being at the mercy of other people and accept that someone else is always going to have the right to tell us what to do. So it's more like you're promoting this idea and you're condemning the idea of people having individual rights and needs and an individual will and so on. So that's quite interesting. So you say that the world is forever divided into the powerful and the powerless, and that we're on the wrong side of that, and that's all right because it's the will of God, and God has ordained. You emphasise ordained that some people will boss other people around, usually men in regard to women. You raise your voice an octave there, and whites in regard to blacks, and you raise your voice an octave there as well. So you're using these oratory techniques in relation to the idea that men are more powerful than women and whites are more powerful than blacks. This is the cultural Marxist narrative that you're emphasising here. Political correctness, that all women are disadvantaged in relation to all men because people only exist in a collective, and that all blacks are disadvantaged in relation to all whites. So you can't ever get to the truth of a situation when you've got this attitude. I'm not saying that sexism and racism don't exist, but you get a situation like in the United States where people are called racist for criticising the president who happens to be black. And this diverts attention away from matters which are people are right to criticise, like his use of illegal drone strikes, for example, and Obamacare, which was a complete disaster. So the cultural Marxist narrative is not intended to empower women or empower black people or eliminate prejudice. It's intended to be a tool of the state to control people's right to the freedom of speech. So if they put a black person in office, then you can't criticise that person, no matter how they behave, simply because they're black. And I can't criticise the Rothschilds because that makes me anti-Semitic. And no one else can criticise the Rothschilds. You're anti-Semitic if you ever criticise any Jew about anything. And as I've said before, personally, I'm anti-psychopath. I'm not anti-Semitic. But if the psychopath happens to be a Jew, too bad. But you've used this cultural Marxist narrative to try and silence me. And this is the purpose of cultural Marxism, also known as political correctness, to stop people being able to criticise the people who are controlling things, really, by saying that these people are disadvantaged and they belong to a disadvantaged group and you're racist if you criticise them. Even if that person or those people happen to be the wealthiest, most powerful people on earth, or even if they're the president of the United States, or if Hillary Clinton were to be elected, people would be sexist if they criticised her. So this is how it goes. You see, this is the purpose of cultural Marxism. It's not to help the people in disadvantaged groups in society, but rather to use people from those groups as a tool to oppress the majority, and to stop people being able to express themselves and criticise corruption among politicians and bankers and all that kind of thing. So anyway, after this, people being bossed around by other people, and you refer to men and women and whites and blacks, and then you add and all the rest of it. You don't distinguish any further groups. And then you say, that's the world. It's a sort of pyramid spreading down, some people on top, some people underneath. And then you say dependence. Well, this is quite interesting because it is a pyramid, and a pyramid is one of the symbols of the Illuminati, and it's their ideal structure of society, that all of the power is located in a minuscule number of people at the top. Some people, particularly in the Occupy movement, refer to the 1%, but it's actually a far more minuscule percentage of people who hold real power than 1%. It's an absolutely minuscule section of the world. So the other interesting thing about this is, as I've said, it's the day after I confronted you in Sheffield. Well, what happened was I went into the meeting, and it was just before it started, and I saw you sitting at the front, and I thought, oh, I'm going to go and sit next to him. But you were sitting in an aisle seat on the left-hand side, and the Bishop of Sheffield, the Anglican Bishop of Sheffield, was sitting to your left. So there was nowhere I could sit down next to you and say hello. So I thought, oh, well, I'll just go and sit in these side seats at the front then. So I went and sat there, and as luck would have it, that was right next to the lectern where you came to speak. So the first part of the meeting took place, and then you came over to the lectern to give your speech. Well, I was facing the lectern, and you were walking towards me, more or less, on a slightly raised platform. And so as soon as I saw you approaching, I made the Illuminati pyramid hand sign, raised it slightly in front of my face, and you were coming across the platform towards the lectern, and you looked at me, and you went absolutely white with fear. I'm not kidding. I've never seen anyone look so frightened in my whole life. And I'm not too sure whether it was just the sight of me that caused that reaction in you, or whether it was the fact I was making the Illuminati hand sign and you knew that I knew what you were up to. And perhaps it was a combination of both. I think it was probably both. So here you are. I made this Illuminati hand sign and some other Illuminati hand signs as well, like the devil horns with my hands, and oh, I covered one of my eyes as well. I probably did some other things as well, but I can't think of them right now. But anyway, so I was doing that from time to time through the lecture when you were gaslighting me. And so this is the day after that. You saw me making this pyramid, and then I'd confronted you and said that you were a Satanist. You worked for MI5, you lied about 9/11, and that you were a Freemason. So you knew that I knew. And here you are, the day after that, talking about the world. That's the world. It's a sort of pyramid spreading down, some people on top, some people underneath. Dependence. So that is the world, really. But I don't think we're dependent. They're trying to make us dependent on the state, by promoting collectivism and suppressing individuality and freedom of speech and so on, and referring to people in collectives like whites and blacks, men and women, dividing society further and further down into smaller and smaller pieces, so that you're supposed to identify with some group, like you identify yourself rather than as a person. You identify yourself as a man or a woman, or as black or as white, or as gay, or as straight, and this kind of thing. And you don't consider your individuality, and that these are only aspects of your identity, and that there's a great overlap between people, and every individual has inherent rights in an individualist understanding of the world. So it's promoting collectivism, dividing society into groups of people rather than focusing on the rights of the individual. So you talk about this pyramid then, and you say, and into the middle of this, Jesus and St. Paul place a very large, well constructed bomb. That's quite an unusual thing to say, especially after I'd confronted you about 9/11 the day before. St. Paul says it's all about freedom. And what's that freedom about? It's all about, if it's all about freedom, freedom is about reconciliation. Oh, I thought it would be. You know, reconciliation really means reconciliation with God. We're alienated from God by our sinful nature, but Christ has died for us. We can turn to Christ and repent of our sins, and we're reconciled with God. We can also be reconciled with other people we've offended, but that kind of means you need to acknowledge that you've done something wrong to them, really, doesn't it? Otherwise, the person will just think he's just going to do the same thing all over again, or he's only trying to save his own skin. So you then go on to say, freedom is precisely about being free from the compulsions of your individual will and your private needs. So this is a further promotion of collectivism. Freedom, salvation really means freedom. Um, you are freed from the flesh, the Bible would say it. It's more like you're freed from being dominated completely by your own wishes. You can surrender your own will to God and follow God's path, and this is the path to salvation. This is freedom. So that doesn't mean subjugating yourself to the collective and saying that other people, particularly powerful people like Anglican archbishops, for example, have the right to try and have you tortured to death and force themselves on you and force their perverted friends on you. It doesn't mean that. That's not freedom at all. That's slavery. And George Orwell did say that freedom is slavery. War is peace and ignorance is strength. And this is the idea you seem to be promoting. I mean, particularly, you're supposed to be some amazing academic theologian. You talk all this crap, and you're just spreading misinformation and disinformation and mumbo jumbo and calling it Christian doctrine. It's unbelievable. So you then say it's the freedom to go and act and make a difference and play your part in the reconciliation of humanity and the world. That's what freedom is about. I don't think that that's what freedom is about at all. I don't even think it's not what freedom is about from a Christian perspective. You're supposed to act in a right way, act in a virtuous way, and preach the gospel, evangelize. And this is to the benefit of yourself and also to other people as well, if you're acting in a virtuous way and you're telling them the gospel. But playing your part in the reconciliation of humanity and the world, do you mean that humanity's going to be reconciled with the world? That sounds what you mean, like what you mean. Or the world's going to be reconciled to God, or people are going to be reconciled to each other. It's quite ambiguous what you're talking about here. More flannel, in other words. And so you go on to say, and dependence, instead of being at the wrong end of somebody telling you what to do, you are depending always profoundly, without qualification, always on the gift of God, and that dependence or the gift of God gives you a remarkable level of independence in regard to everything else. Well, this is true, actually. This is true. And I think you're reflecting over someone you might have met the day before in the things that you say next. So I'm just going to say what you say now without too many comments. So you say, I'm fascinated by the way in which, in Christian history, again and again, the people who make a difference are the people who speak in the most extravagant terms about the majesty and glory of the God they adore and worship without qualification. So it's statements like this that give me the impression that you don't actually believe in God, because you talk about the Christian God, um, the Jesus of the Gospels, and you're now talking about Christians throughout history, and you talk about the God they adore and worship. Whereas if you actually believed in God, you would just say that the people speak in the most extravagant terms about the majesty and glory of God, who they adore and worship, wouldn't you? So the way that you phrase things certainly gives me the impression that you don't actually believe in God. So you say the people who speak in the most extravagant terms about the majesty and glory of the God they adore and worship without qualification, at whose feet they throw themselves in adoration. So this is some good grammar here, because if we'd gone with your usual way of speaking, then you would have said in your super posh aristocratic voice, whose feet they throw themselves at, rather than at whose feet they throw themselves at. So you've actually got it right for once. So you're talking about God here, at whose feet they throw themselves in adoration, and then, so to speak, get up and dust themselves down and go and change the world. The people who really acknowledged the indescribable depth of our dependence on God are the people who seem to have a remarkable lack of anxiety about anyone else's authority and anyone else's orders. Sounds like you're talking about me there, Rowan, because I've got a remarkable lack of anxiety about anyone else's authority and anybody else's orders. I'd question the word authority here, because I think authority is a good thing. If somebody's got authority in a certain area, they're a competent authority, they know what they're talking about, they're skilled in a certain area of life, an academic area or a practical area or something like that, then I respect that authority. The person's got authority, they know what they're talking about, they speak and behave in a competent way. So I don't disrespect authority, but I have got a remarkable lack of anxiety about anybody else's power, because I just haven't got the time or the patience for people like you who throw their weight around, order people around, and think they've got rights over other people, and they're just behaving in an extremely abusive and incompetent way. And I'm not going to pay any attention to anything that anybody says simply because they hold a certain office. And I've always felt that way to some extent, but particularly after what I went through in the Church of England, also in the Church in Wales, but to a lesser extent. I wasn't there as long, really, to be going through that there. But after what I experienced from office holders in these two institutions, then I certainly have no respect at all for someone to be doing what they say simply because they hold a certain office. And so I really pay attention to the things they say and the way that they behave, to decide really whether the person's got authority or not. And obviously, I'm not competent in every area of human life, so I have to trust in the authority of some people sometimes, when I might not know about that area myself. But, you know, if they turn out to be not an authority, so to speak, they're making things up or behaving in an incompetent way, then they're only going to do that once to me, and then I'll move on to try and find someone with more competence and more authority, so to speak, rather than someone who's just holding a particular office. So you then say, we see it just a bit, don't we, in the early chapters of the Acts of the Apostles, when Peter and John are hauled up in front of the high priestly court in Jerusalem and told to stop doing what they're doing. And the calm reply comes, we have to obey God rather than human beings. And obeying God rather than making you some kind of doormat allows you to be extraordinarily independent in your relation with others, to show a kind of authority. And there's that wonderful little line after all that where the priestly court says they recognised that they had been with Jesus. When you see people behaving like that, you recognise where they've been, whose company they've been in, and I like to think of those weighty, rather solemn members of the high priestly court stroking their beards and readjusting their turbans and looking at one another with gloom, as Peter and John say, we must obey God rather than you. And one of them whispering to the other, Jesus, you can tell, you can always tell. And then you give a little laugh. So I think, Rowan, that when you're talking about people devoting themselves to God and not reacting to worldly authority, or rather to worldly power and incompetent and abusive use of power. You're talking about me, aren't you, who had confronted you the day before. So you recognise me actually, don't you, as someone who's devoted to God. And I've made these decisions early in my life and decided to carry on living in this way, and I don't want to turn away from it. This is where I want to carry on going. So all this time when you've been hounding me around the country and telling people I was a prostitute and a repressed lesbian and probably a bank robber and all kinds of other things I don't even know what, and inciting people to treat me in an evil way and trying to trip me up with pathetic efforts at honey traps and all this kind of thing. You knew all along, didn't you? You knew all along. You've known exactly what you're doing. I've said before and demonstrated with clips where you were talking about Dostoevsky and where you were talking about refugees experiencing the same kind of bad experience that they had wherever they'd come from, that people would still be persecuting them in the places where they arrived, and this was the worst thing. And this is exactly what you've done to me. And I've talked about mind control, trauma-based mind control, and this these are the techniques that you were using. You were doing it on purpose. You knew full well all along that I wasn't this person you were telling everybody that I was, and you were trying to destroy me. And you are controlled by Satan. Um, it's Satan attacking me through you and the people who collude with you. So you've shot yourself in the foot again, then, really. That's a wry little laugh at the end that you give there. You know, you've known all along. You've known all along, and that's why you were trying to destroy me, because you're part of this Luciferian conspiracy as well. People who've sold their souls to Satan because they think if they worship the devil, they're going to be able to be ruling over the whole world, because that was one of the temptations of Jesus when he went into the wilderness before the beginning of his ministry, and Satan said to him that he'd give him all the kingdoms of the world if he would bow down and worship him. So you are all Satanists, and you recognise that I was devoted to God, and that was the most important thing to me. And this is why you've been attacking me all these years. I mean, apart from the fact that you're a high functioning psychopath anyway, and you do try and eliminate the competition, and I am competent, and psychologically stable, and you are neither of these things. Well, I suppose you've got a stability in the fact that you always act in a psychopathic way, but you're really all over the place. You haven't even got any inherent identity. You're just a series of masks that you use to try and manipulate people, as I've said before. So I'm going to make another comment in a minute.
And then there's dependence on its own. The willingness to let other people tell us what to do, accepting being slaves, accepting being at the mercy of other people, accepting that somebody else is always going to have the right to tell us what to do and we just have to shrug and get on with it, that the world is forever divided into the powerful and the powerless, and that we're on the wrong side of that, and that that's all right because it's the will of God, and that God has ordained that some people will boss other people around, usually men in regard to women, and whites in regard to blacks, and all the rest of it. That's the world. It's a sort of pyramid spreading down, some people on top, some people underneath. Depend. And into the middle of this, Jesus and St. Paul place a very large, well-constructed bomb. St. Paul says, it's all about freedom. And what's that freedom about? If it's all about freedom, freedom is about reconciliation. Freedom is precisely being free from the compulsions of your individual will and your private needs. It's the freedom to go and act and make a difference and play your part in the reconciliation of humanity and the world. That's what freedom is about. And dependence, instead of being at the wrong end of somebody telling you what to do, you are depending always, profoundly, without qualification, always on the gift of God. And that dependence on the gift of God gives you a remarkable level of independence in regard to everything else. I'm fascinated by the way in which, in Christian history, again and again, the people who make a difference are the people who speak in the most extravagant terms about the majesty and glory of the God they adore and worship without qualification, at whose feet they throw themselves in abject adoration, and they then, so to speak, get up, dust themselves down, and go and change the world. The people who really acknowledge the indescribable depth of our dependence on God are the people who seem to have a remarkable lack of anxiety about anybody else's authority and anybody else's orders. We see it just a bit, don't we, in the early chapters of the Acts of the Apostles, when Peter and John are hauled up in front of the high priestly court in Jerusalem and told to stop doing what they're doing. And the calm reply comes, we have to obey God rather than human beings. And obeying God, rather than making you some kind of doormat, allows you to be extraordinarily independent in your relation with others, to show a kind of authority. And there's that wonderful little line after all that, where the priestly court says, they recognized that they had been with Jesus. When you see people behaving like that, you recognize where they've been, whose company they've been in. And I like to think of those weighty, rather solemn members of the high priestly court, stroking their beards and readjusting their turbans and looking at one another with gloom, as Peter and John say, we must obey God rather than you. And one of them sort of whispering to the other, Jesus. You know, you can tell, you can always tell.
Now, I'm not going to say too much about my beloved tonight because you already know how gorgeous and wonderful he is, and that I'm looking forward to being with him, and that he's so sexy, and I just can't find enough good words to describe him. He's so perfect. Anyway, he's really the man for me. I can't believe I've met him. So, I am going to play a song at the end of this, I hope, if it isn't copyrighted. Um, I'm going to play another song at the end of this, which, funnily enough, we actually sang at the worship at this meeting in Sheffield that I came to, Churches Together in South Yorkshire. Um, Be Thou My Vision. We sang that song, and I'm going to play that song rather than my usual compilation about my wonderful beloved, which I will probably be playing in my next video. And I may make another video about this lecture in Sheffield. You did actually give another talk in Sheffield, which is also on YouTube. You gave this talk the morning after I'd confronted you the night before, and then you gave another talk in the afternoon. So I might do some videos about the other talk as well, and I may do another one about this one, or I may just move on because as I've said, there's just so much shit you've talked already. Even if you never say another word of shit in your entire life, there's plenty to be going on with. So I'll leave it there for this evening. But don't forget to be alert because you never know when I'm going to turn up to arrest you for terrorism. So I'll leave it there until Sunday. Hasta la próxima.
Viva